Looks like we're live. Okay. Garrett Graff, I am so happy to be joined by you for so many reasons. First of all, you are such an accomplished historian. You are out with a fantastic new book that is already on the New York Times bestseller list. The title is The Devil Reached Toward the Sky, an oral history of the making and unleashing of the atomic bomb. First, congratulations.
Thank you so much. It was an exciting news to get last night that we debuted at number 7 on the New York Times bestseller list.
So well deserved. I want to start before we get into the atomic bomb in this history by just sort of acknowledging you. I knew you when I was back in Washington as a White House correspondent, and you were this new blogger on the block. You were doing the exact opposite of what you do right now, churning out daily, actually like hourly content online. And I think you were the first credentialed blogger at the White House. Um, do I have that right?
Yeah, the first blogger accredited to cover a White House press briefing in March of 2005.
I remember you were like so young and new and lovely and like smarter than so many people, and you've always just been a wonderful person. In addition to your talent, you've just been kind in all these high stress environments, and congratulations on all your success.
Thank you. I really
Um,
appreciate that.
it's true. It's also interesting to me that you started your career in sort of this nascent digital space, which is so fast paced and so much, frankly, about noise. And then you covered so much, you were a politics editor in DC. And now you really take your time and delve deep into history. As a person who understands the pace at which media moves these days, the speed with which we all run our lives, why do you think it's important for us to spend time on history, and why do you do it?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one I've always been interested in history. My elementary school teacher, Mrs. Stochek, who I actually dedicated my book last year to, which was another oral history about D-Day. She said to me in first grade that she had never met a student as interested in nonfiction as I was. So the history nerd has always been there in me. But I think one of the things that covering Washington teaches you, if you're paying attention, is how important history is to understanding today.
Yeah.
And I actually think, it is one of my major critiques of a lot of our journalism colleagues is the way that too many of them, I think, approach day-to-day news coverage as if this is all new and has never happened before.
Mm,
Um, and the answer is almost always that it has happened before. And that, to me, a big part of appropriately contextualizing what is going on today is understanding why things are the way that they are. And so I always joke that my work is often around history books that could unfortunately get placed in the current events section of
yeah.
a bookstore. In the first Trump administration, I wrote a book about Watergate and sort of the first time that we went after a corrupt and criminal president in office. Um, and as we can talk about, this book about World War II and nuclear weapons has unfortunate modern relevance
Yeah.
as well. But I think so much of my work is about trying to use history to understand the story of today.
And this topic is it's extremely relevant this week, in fact, as Trump prepares to meet with Putin, and Putin has floated some kind of nuclear deal, which we will get to. I want to talk about the book. So, based on, I understand you have more than 500 oral histories from people who were alive and involved somehow, either on the development of the atomic bomb or in Japan when it hit. You've gone through reams of documents, so much history. Would you just, before we get into the larger conversation, remind us what was the Manhattan Project? Why was it so meaningful and unique that the U.S. dropped the bomb? And what was the importance of that moral decision whether or not to do it?
Yeah. So this book is my third book-length volume of oral history. As you know, I've done previous books on 9/11 that was called The Only Plane in the Sky, that brought together the voices of about 500 Americans as they lived that day, morning to night, coast to coast, September 11th, 2001. And then a book last year called When the Sea Came Alive that was actually about 700 voices related to the planning and execution and experience of D-Day itself, June 6th, 1944. Um, so those books were the single most important day of the 21st century, the single most important day of the 20th century. And when I was thinking about what to do next, I was attracted to the idea of the Manhattan Project. We're marking, of course, the 80th anniversary, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki this month, the end of the war in Japan. But I would argue that the invention of the atomic bomb and all that it changed in the world was the most important moment of the 20th century. And that it changes science, it changes politics, it changes international relations. It changes our economy, and changes the way that government and scientists work together in ways that we can talk about. But the Manhattan Project was this crash effort that was brought together and started by a group of mostly Jewish refugee scientists fleeing the enveloping cloak of Nazi fascism in Europe in the 1930s, who came to the United States with the knowledge of the new discovery of nuclear fission and the power that that could unleash. And they spent, it's sort of funny now realizing how we consider the Manhattan Project one of the great triumphs of human innovation, because it took about 2 years to get the U.S. government interested in it at all. And you have all these scientists, going around knocking on every government and military door that they can, saying, "Hey, there's this thing called an atomic bomb. We think it can be built. We think the Germans are building it now, and we don't want Hitler to get the bomb first." And that really becomes the motivating factor for how the U.S. begins to launch this effort that then culminates not in the use of the bomb in Germany, which was the original goal and the original target of the bomb, trying to drop it on Berlin, but in the final stages of the war in Japan, that helped speed the end of the war, 80 years ago, actually tomorrow, August 15th.
Before we go further, I want to just take a moment to turn to the Japanese perspective. And you interviewed people who were there, not killed by the bomb, obviously, but impacted by its effects. What were some of the recollections? How did people describe the horror and the unique experience they had when the U.S. dropped the bomb?
Yeah. The book is all based on archival sources. I did get the chance to actually meet with survivors when I went to Japan as part of book research. But a big part of my oral history process is trying to find the recollections as close to the original events as possible. So I was, and I have to say, even as someone who has written about 9/11 and D-Day, the stories of the Hibakusa, the bomb-affected people in Japan, are some of the most searing reading I have ever come across. And there's actually some interesting history in that word. They were known as bomb-affected people because it was a value-neutral judgment or value-neutral statement. And the U.S. was, we occupied Japan after the war, and there was a lot of censorship and resistance to the talking about the bomb, the reality of the bomb. And so, these are not bomb survivors. They're not bomb victims. Yeah. These are people affected by the bomb, which I think is this incredibly interesting political statement on its own.
Yeah. And what are some of the recollections, or what's one description of what the experience was like?
Yeah. One of the things that comes out of reading these and following this story is, none of the people who were in Hiroshima or Nagasaki had ever heard of an atomic bomb. And
Mm,
so they had no idea what the thing was that actually had happened to
mm,
them. And I think that's one of the real powers to me of oral history is I think often history books make events seem neater, cleaner, simpler, and more preordained than they felt to anyone at the time. Look at this modern moment that we're living through right now. We have no idea where this story goes.
yeah.
We have no idea whether we are in the beginning, the middle, or the end of the story that we are living through right now.
Hmm.
And there's a power that comes in oral history that allows you to go back and experience these big apocal historical events where we all know the ending, um, but live them in the eyes and the words of people who didn't know the ending when they were having these experiences. And so, a big part of the the what I tried to do with this book was put you back in the experiences of these people, on the Manhattan Project as they are working on an atomic bomb where they don't know who's going to win World War II. They don't know whether Adolf Hitler is going to get the bomb first. Um, they don't know whether an atom bomb will work at all. And then in Japan on August 6th, in Hiroshima on August 9th, in Nagasaki, these people see a single plane flying in the skies over their heads, and then there there's this explosion, and they don't understand what has happened. They don't understand the power of it. They um and they don't they're sort of all trying to process in real time the landscapes that they're confronting.
Yeah.
The idea that there's they've survived in the rubble of wherever they are, and then the city when they emerge is gone and on fire.
So let me ask you, one of the, when you're in school and studying history, one of the key moments you stay on for a long time is the US decision whether or not to drop this bomb. Um, the argument being it will end the war, and that is a human good, ending war. The argument against, I'm oversimplifying,
Yeah.
being this enormously destructive force that has never been unleashed. Um, as you looked back on this, did you come up, which side of that argument did you land on, or would you nuance it beyond what I've said?
Yeah. It's a fantastically complex decision. And again, part of the complexity is we have a lot of knowledge now about just how terrible the bomb actually was that they didn't have then. The idea of radiation poisoning was not something that was well understood
Mhm.
in that moment, in that era. Um, that said, one of the things that really does, uh, uh, you know, I, as I sort of break it down in my own head, it's absolutely true that dropping the atomic bomb saves American lives. What I think a lot of people don't really factor into it is the extent to which dropping the bomb probably saves Japanese lives in an incredibly cold and terrible calculus of war.
Mm.
Um, Japan was facing widespread starvation from the U.S. naval blockade in the summer and fall of 1945. They were on pace for a famine that was going to kill about 200,000 civilians a month entering the fall of 45. Um, and the US was actually engaged in this incredibly deadly and widespread firebombing of
Yeah.
Japanese cities, which most Americans don't really factor in or understand.
Can we just take
Um,
a beat on that? Firebombing means literally setting
yes.
cities on
Yep.
fire,
Yep.
killing,
So,
destroying. Yeah, go ahead.
yep. So, the single deadliest day of World War II, the single deadliest day of human conflict is not the atomic bombings. It is Operation Meeting House, the incendiary raids that we launch in March of 1945 on Tokyo, where we burn Tokyo and kill 100,000 Japanese in the course of a single night. We go on from there to firebomb 66 Japanese cities over the course of the spring and summer. So, I mean, that works out basically every other night we are burning to the ground a Japanese city. And they, destroying 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80% of some of these cities. Thousands of people dying in single nights. Down to, by the way, sort of there's this really haunting map at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans where they line up each of the Japanese cities that we firebomb with an American equivalent, and in terms of population. And so, yes, we burn New York, we burn Los Angeles, but by the time we are working our way down this list, like we're burning cities the size of Des Moines and Grand Rapids and San Antonio, and that actually the firebombing is so devastating that we actually have to, U.S. war planners have to set Hiroshima and Nagasaki aside to save them for the atomic bomb.
Oh my God.
Because if we
burned them, it wouldn't be devastating enough.
Right. If we firebomb those cities first, there's not going to be enough of the city left to drop an atomic bomb.
Can I ask you a question? Going back, when did that blockade start? Like, how long was the starvation before and the fire bombing and all this going on?
So this is all happening across 1945. And that firebombing starts in March 1949, continues, as I said, basically at the pace of like a different city every other night through the rest of that spring and summer. The naval blockade is, slowly strangling Japan over the course of that spring and summer. And what you see is that even after all of that, even after that firebombing, even after the spreading starvation, even after the two atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, that actually the Japanese government is not particularly, there are factions of the Japanese government that still do not want to surrender. That actually 80 years ago tonight, August 14th, the sort of far right imperial wing of the Japanese military stages a coup that storms the emperor's palace to try to find and destroy the emperor's surrender message before it can be played to the Japanese public on August 15th. And it's really only the emperor's push and the emperor's reaction to the atomic bombs that bring the war to a close on August 15th. And there's sort of a funny story you will like to the coup that I don't get into too deep in the book, but they don't find the surrender message has been burned onto a record that will be played on the radio on the 15th. And they don't find the record because it has been hidden in the women's part of the emperor's palace, where men are not allowed
it would never
to go. And it's sort of like a funny, like moral calculus for me in the coup is that they're like, we'll storm the emperor's palace, but we
not
won't
go
into the
side.
women's portion because obviously that would be bad.
Right. Every judgment is based within its own cultural context, right? That's phenomenal. What an interesting story to be telling right now as we face so many wars that are not coming to a close. I could stay on this for so long. I just want us to get forward into some of the questions of today that are implicated in the book. Can I ask you, do you have like 10 more minutes or do you have to? Okay, great. One question is, developing the bomb actually taught us a lot. I feel taught us a lot about science, about our own origins, our own capability. And we do see this repeatedly in Defense Department history, that in the course of developing weapons, we develop all sorts of technology for, peacetime goods. I think the Wi-Fi came from DoD investigating and DARPA. What did we learn outside of a death machine from developing the bomb?
So it's actually, to me, the most important thing that the Manhattan Project does, which is it's not that we invent the atomic bomb out of it. It's that we learn how government and science can work together. And that before the war, the US did not view science and technology as a core strength of the United States.
Hmm.
And that we did not have any meaningful relationship between government and higher education, between science research funding, medical research funding, and that one of the things I really tried to do with this book is emphasize how we usually talk about World War II as the places where it's fought. That we talk about Bastogne and El Alamein and Guadalcanal and Okinawa and Omaha Beach, but where World War II is actually won is in the industrial might that the United States brings to bear on World War II. And it's actually won in the Ford Motor Company bomber factories in Willow Run, Michigan. It's won in the shipyards and landing craft factories of Higgins Industry in New Orleans. And it's won in the Rad Lab at MIT that develops radar and helps develop the proximity fuse. And it's won in the factories of the Manhattan Project. And the success of the Manhattan Project is not in the sort of Oppenheimer movie version of J. Robert Oppenheimer in a lab in Los Alamos, which is important and factually accurate as far as it goes. It's in the secret cities that we build in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington, that are where we manufacture and process and refine the uranium and plutonium that go into the bombs. And that these are, in Tennessee, remote mountain valleys, in Washington State, desert and fruit orchards that the government seizes, and in the space of about 2 years, build facilities that are like 50 miles wide by 50 miles long that each employ about 100,000
Oh my
people.
gosh.
So much so that the bus system in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, on August 6th, 1945, which is the day the Manhattan Project is announced to the world for the first time, the bus system in Oak Ridge, Tennessee is one of the 10 largest public transit systems in the United States, and it serves a city that no one knows exists and that doesn't appear on any public map.
Wow.
And what you see is it's these factories that make the difference. And in Oak Ridge, it's this incredible story that I love. There's some of my favorite chapters in the book where Tennessee Eastman is the company that the government brings in to run these uranium factories. And the machines are called Calutrons. And this in 1943, 1944, the men are all away fighting the war. And so Eastman says, we're going to hire all of these girls graduating from high school in rural Tennessee to run the Calutrons. And the Berkeley nuclear PhDs are all like, we can't teach a girl how to run the uranium machines. And so Tennessee Eastman does this head-to-head test of these high school graduates fresh out of school in Tennessee, and these Berkeley PhDs, and the women actually outperform the men in building or running the machines. But what ends up happening is these Calutron girls, as they come to be known, they refine all of the uranium for the atomic bombs. Almost all of them learn the word uranium for the first time on August 6th, 1945, when the project is announced to the public. They work for years in these factories, never knowing what the
they were
machine
doing
does.
Oh my God.
That
Did
they're
they end
working
up
all day.
sick?
No, so they didn't actually end up getting sick.
Okay.
And that's sort of a subplot of the story. But what the Manhattan Project sort of does in these ways is show how important the way that the US government can work with science and technology. And exactly as you're saying, this becomes the model for how the US becomes an economic superpower after the war. And we found the National Science Foundation. The NIH becomes this massive grant giver of medical research funding. and it builds the modern world, the model that the Manhattan Project lays out. And the thing that really terrifies me in this book coming out in 2025 is we are watching the precise dismantling right now of the model that the Manhattan Project taught us about how to be a successful innovator in the world. And
Well, to not put too fine a point on it, government funded all the things you're talking about. So pulling government funding would have meant none of this would have been developed.
And all of the things since. I mean,
Right.
the sort of the structure of research that we use after World War II is what gives us the internet. It's what gives us um, text messaging. It's what gives us smartphones. It's what gives us web browsers. Not to mention all of the other non-internet things that the internet helps fund. Including the mRNA Moderna COVID vaccine, which grows directly out of government-supported research by DARPA. I think we're watching in higher ed, in science labs, in medical labs, the Trump administration just decimate that model of innovation and invention.
It's so timely that you're talking about this now. I want to touch on also just would you take us into the very modern moment? And what are our current nuclear superpowers? And would you give us a sense, what does getting the bomb these days do for a country?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think a lot of us don't think about is that in this moment in 2025, we are probably closer to the nuclear precipice than we have been for most of the 80 years in between since the dropping of the the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And what I mean by that is if you look at today's landscape, we have already seen this year conflict between India and Pakistan, which are the two largest nuclear arsenals to ever come into open conflict. We've already seen the US and Israeli raids on the Iranian nuclear program. The roots of the war in Ukraine are really about how Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear weapons at the end of the Cold War following the collapse of the Soviet Union in exchange for security guarantees that the West did not live up to. And I think that that's important because there are a lot of world leaders out there right now who have relied on the US nuclear umbrella for the last 80 years and are watching the growing instability of the US
Yeah.
politically and geopolitically and saying, I don't know if we want to keep relying on the US as our nuclear umbrella, particularly given what has happened to Ukraine when the US is not willing to actually stand up and defend the security guarantees it says. And so you are beginning to have nuclear proliferation conversations in Europe, in the Middle East, in and in Asia that would have been unthinkable not that long ago. Conversations in Germany about whether Germany should develop a bomb. Conversations in Southeast Asia about whether Korea should get a bomb, whether Japan should get a bomb, which is
Mm.
a like literally unthinkable political
Wow.
decision not that long ago. But I think we are going to see over this next decade a bunch of countries thinking about or joining the nuclear club that have never uh, been part of that. And I think that one of the things I really wanted to try to do with this project is capture and retell the experiences of the people who survived those nuclear bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki at a moment where their generation is passing away,
Mm.
so that it's up to our generation in our time to carry forward their dream that they are the last survivors of a nuclear weapon. Because, the central organizing principle of geopolitics for the last 80 years has been that these weapons should never be used again. And I worry a lot that we are losing our reluctance to
Mm,
use these weapons over
mm.
the next couple of years.
Such a you say it so beautifully, Garrett. I love talking to you. Um, I wanna wrap up, but I also think there's another point to hit, which is something I'd like to say. I wanna find the right words and say this delicately. It's important for us to also understand th the horrors of war, and they are gruesome to look at, and it's helpful to remember that we have seen this kind of horror we are seeing today before. That I think a lot of the people who are just tuning into global politics look at what's happening around the world and are astonished that humanity does this to one another, and humanity has done this to one another for all of time.
Yeah.
Is there anything to be learned from how we ended that war and how, they suffered and we suffered, or we won, but they suffered, that is important to keep in mind today?
Yeah. Uh, so I think that there's a lesson that I hope readers think about in this book, and also in the book that I did last year on D-Day, which is, it does not feel like a coincidence to me that we are flirting with authoritarianism here in the United States and watch democracy backsliding in the United States at the precise moment that we are losing the greatest generation.
Mm,
Um, because we are losing the generation who both fought World War II and so
mm,
knows how terrible authoritarianism actually is in practice. You know, the people who actually walked through and liberated the concentration
yeah,
camps in Germany and Europe. The people who understand how hard authoritarianism and fascism is to root out once it takes hold, and the people who understand uh, how hard it was to build the system of institutions that we created after World War II to ensure that these things never happen again. And that, I mean, NATO and the United Nations and USAID and the Peace Corps and a whole bunch of other things, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, institutions that are themselves, very much imperfect, and I will be the first to tell you that none of those was or is a perfect institution, um, but that they were institutions that made the world better, and not perfect but better, and that for 80 years they kept the peace at a global level, which again does not mean there was not war, does not mean that there was not famine, does not mean that there was not starvation or genocide or terrible things that humans did to one another. But for a generation at the end of World War II who had seen two world scale conflagrations in their lifetimes between World War I and World War II, the fact that for 80 years we had peace in Europe, for 80 years we did not go nuclear in the Cold War or any subsequent conflict, is actually a tremendously hard success that a
hmm,
lot of people worked on really, really hard for their entire careers. And I worry that we are watching those accomplishments be unwound by a generation who grew up in a moment of unparalleled human security, safety, and prosperity, and health, by the way, incredible period of health and achievement in the world post World War II, who do not recognize how hard and unusual that period of health, safety, security, and prosperity actually was to achieve along the way. And that um, I think we are going to miss that era when it is gone. And we are going to miss an era where we do not have those robust institutions protecting a rules based international order that could secure global peace and prosperity in the decade ahead.
Well, Garrett, I am glad that you've preserved their stories and given us a chance to learn from their lessons. Thank you so much for your work and for your the incredible integrity you bring to the stories you tell and preserving American history.
So thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Jess.
Let's not wait until your next book comes out. You're welcome here anytime. I want to remind people to buy The Devil Reached Toward the Sky. It's available now, and you can help push it up the bestseller list. So to everybody, thank you for watching. Garrett, thank you. Please come back soon.
Thanks so much.
Okay, talk to you. Bye.